Hello and welcome to what I hope will be the first of a series of videos on ethics of technology. Please sit back and enjoy the ride.
Viridian Dynamics. Doing the right thing. It's important. What does it mean in business? We have no idea. We know what wrong is. Actually, no, we don't. Because we're a successful company, not some boring ethics professor. Viridian Dynamics. Right and wrong. It means something. We just don't know what.
This is a video series which I hope will be used to introduce issues related to the ethics of technology. This is based on the belief that philosophy, and especially ethics, is an important field that people should be aware of, that it will be useful for people, that it will help to spur conversations related to important questions concerning the ethical development and use of technology, that it will help clarify all of the stuff that people have talked about for hundreds and thousands of years and synthesize it into usable material, and hopefully get big ideas out of the ivory tower and make them relevant for average people on the ground.
The ivory tower!
This will be one of 2 or possibly 4 series of videos. There will be a lower level and an upper level of courses of videos. The lower level, which is what this one is designed to be more practical and more introductory. It's designed to help us to get our feet on the ground, as it were, to understand what are the basics of philosophy, the basics of ethics of technology, what are the most fundamental concerns, and will be mostly practical in that manner. The upper level will be more focused on theoretical questions and issues related to big questions in both ethics and philosophy of technology, and so it will be much more of a mind in the cloud sort of area. So first, it's important for us to understand that these videos are based in philosophy, and they'll try to make to work in a way that is faithful both to philosophy but also makes the material accessible. This is a difficult task because often philosophers write in ways that are really hard to understand, which is why not a lot of people read philosophy for fun. But it's also important because philosophy is useless if it doesn't have any meaning to people outside of academia. One of the more famous philosophers alive today, Alasdair MacIntyre, has sometimes said, if you're not able to explain a concept in a way that somebody who doesn't have much of an education can understand it, then you probably don't really understand the concept yourself. So this video series is a way of trying to make sure that people who don't necessarily have degrees in philosophy can understand things that are going on. Philosophical thought, unfortunately, does not always fit into easy frameworks. So because of this, the videos won't always follow the same format. They won't always be laid out and methodical, and they may not even have similar times. So sometimes it may be 5 minutes, sometimes it may be 8 minutes, sometimes it could be an hour, sometimes it might just be a minute. I beg your indulgence on that, and please recognize that this is part of the difficulty of what philosophy is. Another thing that we should be aware of is that while there are clear methods and styles for thinking about ethics, and you'll see that in the third video of this series, sometimes moral thought goes in directions that are hard to predict. So sometimes we may expect that it will follow a mathematical formula, a plus b minus c equals x. In terms of utilitarianism, we see something very similar. The number of people who are happy, subtract the number of people who are unhappy, should tell us how good a choice is. But then we end up with many problems because of that. And the ideas that were presented by people like Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill 200 years ago may not be as easily applicable to people today because we face new problems, and the way we think about things is different from them. So some of the ways we might challenge this is we ask questions like, how do we measure happiness? John Stuart Mill says we measure pleasure. Well, that's great, but then how do we measure pleasure? When we're measuring this, do we make sure that each person counts? Do we check every choice that we make to add up how much happiness comes down? How far down the road do we have to evaluate the consequences? Do we just look today, tomorrow, an hour from the choice, 2 years from the choice, 100 years from the choice? Do animals count? If animals are affected, is that relevant for our moral reasoning? Can a robot be considered a human? And if we've made a bad decision, what do we do? And all of these questions can lead us asking bigger questions, and we end up with the question of what now? What do we do now that we've made a bad choice? What now? So hopefully we'll be able to answer those questions in due time, and we'll be able to get a better sense of how we can apply moral reasoning. Now, philosophy itself isn't just ethics. Ethics is one branch, but philosophy has several branches to it. For example, there is epistemology, which is how we know what we know and what it means to know. Additionally, there's metaphysics, which is a question of what exists beyond what we can see, whether, for example, there's a God or whether there's an afterlife. There's logic, which is the way reason should work and the way we believe that rationality ought to operate, or even aesthetics, which is theories about what makes something beautiful or what makes something non-beautiful. Additionally, we have to recognize any decisive position we take is basically a philosophy. So a political position, if you're conservative or liberal, a method for learning about the universe like science, an economic attitude like capitalism or socialism, a belief about God, anything along those lines, any position we take that is decisive is a philosophy. So we can't get away from philosophy, but sometimes we embrace philosophies that are not well thought out. Ethics, as we'll see today, is one branch of philosophy. So with that being said, what is ethics? We hear the word used all the time.
How long since your last confession?
Christ, I never confessed. I come here for advice, not salvation.
Why have you come to a church for counsel if you're not religious?
It's ethics.
What does ethics mean, and why is it important? There's a good chance that when you think about ethics, one of the things you think about is a trolley problem. This is one of the most famous thought experiments used to talk about ethics. This was first proposed by the philosopher Philippa Foot. And if you're not familiar with it, the basic format of the trolley problem is that there's a trolley, a runaway trolley, barreling down the tracks. Apparently there's nobody inside of it to slam on the brakes, and there are workers down the track. For some reason they can't hear the trolley, maybe they're using jackhammers, and the details of the story are irrelevant, but they're somewhat convoluted, and you happen to be standing at a switch. Now, you don't have time to get the workers off the track. There's 5 on the track where the trolley is moving down, but you can throw the switch, and if you throw the switch, the trolley will move down another side of the track and kill one worker who's there. So basically, the trolley problem says if you don't make any decision, 5 people die. And if you do make a decision, then you're responsible for 1 person dying. So this is the way most people think about ethical problems. They think of this as an issue: do I choose to kill 1 person, or do I allow 5 people to die? But realistically, ethics is not about that primarily. Ethics is not game theory. It's not a way of trying to figure out what's the best possible outcome or trying to solve unsolvable problems. Things like the Kobayashi Maru from Star Trek are not typically what ethics is supposed to do. There are other things that ethics is not. Consider, for example, this article from the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, one of the larger ethics centers in the United States. Not only does it give us a framework for making ethical decisions, but it begins, as many ethics texts do, by explaining what ethics is, and it does so by first defining what ethics is not. Here are some things that Markkula Center has decided to clarify as not being what ethics is. It describes ethics as not feelings. That is, ethics is not based in personal emotions. Ethics is not religion. And we'll have to put an asterisk there because that's a difficult one to argue. Ethics is not exactly the same thing as following the law. It's not following culturally accepted norms, and it's not science. Now, the reason they begin this way is by wanting to clarify for you not only that there are some things that we take to be good standards, which may not be the same thing as ethics, but also to clarify that ethical thinking has to be different from these things. Some of these things are very important for ethical thinking, but it's important to note that they're not synonymous. So, for example, many tech firms will employ somebody to ensure compliance and regulation. This is an issue of following the law. Now, it's important to follow the law. The laws ideally are designed to protect the common good. If everybody follows the laws, ideally society should be just, but there are some laws we know historically that are not just laws that have caused problems, and there are sometimes examples where people break the law and do something moral. So, for example, we can say we know that there are people who use the excuse that they're following the law to get away with many unethical things. For example, they may justify taking out large tax cuts instead of paying their fair share because it's legal. On the other hand, people like Martin Luther King and many of the civil rights activists of the 1960s and 70s broke the law in order to ensure that what would happen later on would be just and right. So it's important to note that there are many different things that shape our behavior and our action within society, but many of them do not qualify as ethics. So what is ethics? Well, an important question we come to is there a difference between ethics and morality? My students often say that there is, and sometimes when I ask them what the difference is, they tell me something along these lines. Ethics is about rules, it's about what society expects of us, it's about the scientific study of choices we make. Morality, on the other hand, is about personal beliefs about what we think we should do or what we shouldn't do. So ethics has this notion of being objective, of being impersonal, of being socially based, and morality has this notion of being personal, of being subjective, and of being individual. The problem is, when we talk about ethics, what we're talking about typically is one of two things. One, we might be talking about moral philosophy, and if you've watched the TV show The Good Place, you know that the character Chidi is a moral philosopher. The other branch of ethics we might talk about is moral theology, and here we have a picture of James Martin, a famous Jesuit who's the editor of America Magazine and often has appeared on shows like The Colbert Report. These are the two branches, broad branches of ethics, and when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about these things. So the word moral shows up already. Another problem is the words ethics and morality respectively come from two different languages. Ethics comes from Greek. It comes from the word ethos, which means something like character or personality of a given people. For example, if you think of yourself as a proud American, whatever that entails, being a proud American, that's part of your ethos. On the other hand, morality comes from the Latin word mores, which is the customs or habits of a given cultural group. So, for example, the mores for Americans might be going to a 4th of July parade. We can see here then that ethos and mores are similar in ways that we can't really dismiss, right? Because we're talking about things that are related to our character, our personality, and our understanding of ourselves as people within a certain culture. So for all intents and purposes, I will be using the words ethics and morality interchangeably. It's important for us to get this sense under our belts. First of all, because if ethics is different from morality, if morality is personal and subjective and ethics is not, then there's a problem there already. The idea of ethics is that it's supposed to influence our personal behavior, so our morality, if it's personal or if it's subjective, should be shaped by ethics. Additionally, aside from this, when we look at books written about ethics, it's really hard to separate those books that are focused on ethics and those books that are focused on morality. Here are just some examples. We see Nicomachean Ethics, the first book where the word ethics appears, but then we have books like Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals or Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. And so we see there's actually a fair amount of books that use either the word moral or morals or the word ethics, and they almost use them interchangeably. So that's just important for us to get down. When we're thinking about morals, we're typically thinking about ethics. When we're thinking about ethics, we're typically thinking about morals. So what's a good definition then? Ethics is a prescriptive study of right and wrong, good and bad. It's prescriptive because, like medicine, it is designed to give you good advice on what you should or should not do. Sometimes ethicists focus on what we say is the good life, Other times we focus on universally binding rules. Other times still we focus on increasing the amount of pleasure possible. All of these are different views. However, they are just disagreements on what we mean by good. All of them have to do with good and bad, or right and wrong, and how we can live or act in ways that follow these ideas. So then ethics boils down to three major questions. First, what is good? Second, is there a way we can figure out or we can decide to do what is good? And third, based on this, what is good to do in a particular situation? These three questions correspond to three broad fields within ethics: meta-ethics, normative ethics or theoretical ethics, and applied ethics or practical ethics. These three branches we'll focus on in the next three videos. The first, just to understand though, they form a hierarchical organization. Meta-ethics is primary, it goes above normative ethics and it informs normative ethics. Normative ethics informs what is done in applied ethics, and applied ethics is going to be the most ground level. Meta-ethics is going to be the most abstract and theoretical. Under meta-ethics, we have different positions that we can look at, different positions and ideologies we can espouse. These include things like believing that God decides what's good, what we call divine command, believing that there is no such thing as an absolute standard of right and wrong, what we might call relativism, or believing, for example, that right and wrong is just based in our understanding, innate understanding, which we call intuitionism. Normative ethics is what more people are probably familiar with. It includes basic theories, theories like natural law, virtue ethics, utilitarianism, or deontology. These different theories each have different approaches, and even within these theories there are different branches of theories that we might look at. For example, under utilitarianism we have rule utilitarianism or act utilitarianism. Under deontology, we have different versions like Kantian deontology or human rights theory. And under practical ethics, we look at basic areas of life, things like technological ethics, environmental ethics, sexual ethics, business ethics, just war theory, bioethics, etc. So what we're going to be talking about overall, technological ethics is a field within applied ethics, and so it's fairly narrow, fairly specific. It's more or less a question of doing the right thing in specific areas, and in this case, questions of new technologies. What this means then is we might take an example and we might say, well, ethical naturalism, the idea that good is natural, that it exists within nature, especially within human nature, informs deontology. It can tell us the rules and responsibilities we're supposed to follow. Kantian deontology in particular believes that reason is innate and is the objective standard by which all moral action has to be weighed. Kantian deontology can then inform bioethics and can tell us that we shouldn't do anything that would violate principles of rationality or that would somehow harm the rationality of a human being. And so in this case, we might say something like genetic engineering, which could affect a person's nature or a person's reasoning, might be a violation of Kantian principles based in deontology, which is basically rooted in naturalism. So we see these things interact with each other and inform each other. Finally, the last question we need to really ask ourselves is, why should we be ethical? Ethics won't make us rich. It won't make us famous or powerful. It may not guarantee us future success. It may not even improve our reputation. And it doesn't necessarily guarantee us happiness, though there are some ethicists who disagree on that position overall. That doesn't give us a good view of why we should be ethical, right? It leaves us with a bad taste in our mouth. We might think, well, ethicists are just going to be old fuddy-duddies who want to prevent us from having fun. So if that were the case, I definitely wouldn't be able to sell you on why you should be ethical, and this would be a very difficult task making the remaining movies. Emmanuel Levinas, who was a 20th century ethicist and who survived World War II fighting for the French resistance while his wife and daughter lived in a refugee camp. He said that ethics is an optics. It's a way that we see the world, the way that we perceive everything around us. Part of the human condition is living with other humans, family, friends, coworkers, customers, rude drivers who can't follow basic road etiquette, politicians, neighbors, people who like the sports teams you hate. As long as humans have lived with each other, which has been our entire existence, we have needed to think about what our responsibilities are to other humans. In fact, humans aren't humans without other humans. We may go crazy.
Well done! Well done! Well done!
Ethics is a way of understanding and thinking about where we fit into this big picture. How am I, as an individual, connected to other people? The miserly misanthrope may make millions,
If they'd rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population.
but we would hardly consider him a fine specimen of human achievement. Ethics is a way of considering our responsibilities and seeing where we fit in this bigger picture that we call the human race.